Historic for two reasons. One is because, as far as I know, we've not done an August presentation before. And also because we're doing this in hybrid fashion. We have a hearty group of 10 to 12 of us here, the few, the proud. And let me just tell you, we are enjoying our Bloody Marys. And no, I'm just kidding. But we are pleased to actually be back in a room and see each other responsibly. We've got masks, except for when we're eating. And we look forward to more of these, but because this is the first time we've done this, you'll excuse us if there are a few bumps along the way, but we're hopeful that this will work out well. We are recording the session so that it can be replayed later on, and we will no doubt learn from whatever mistakes we make today, and hopefully have more smooth presentations into the fall, September and October. It's been a tradition of this chapter to go around the room and introduce ourselves. That's going to be somewhat awkward, but we're going to give it a shot here. So in the room here, and I'm just going to go down our list, and then I'm going to, when we get done with the room here, oh, we've got a microphone, so we're going to try that.
You're the adult, John.
And then we'll go around virtually and see who's here, and take 10 seconds and introduce yourself. We have a pretty good crowd. We got 28 people online, so we're going to try to move through this efficiently and effectively. Okay, let's go around the room. Seema? Sure, go ahead. Okay, that's Seema.
I'm retired as the Howard County Planning Director. I'm now harassing people in Baltimore County to make change.
It's Marsha McLaughlin.
Lianos, very embarrassed to be the only person with a tie. But I just wanted to prove I could still tie it.
Jim Lianos, who can still tie a tie. So there we go.
I'm impressed. I'm not sure. It's Ken Rice with Homer Hoyt Associates.
Well, he does have insurance now.
Developers, mostly Baltimore City, that do a lot of this use.
Ken Rice from our friends, the developers. Mr. Himmelrich, go ahead, Michael.
Mike Manis, house partner.
Our partner, Mike Manis. And David, who has a mouthful of food here.
David Ben with Quinn Evans Architects and membership chair.
All right.
Oh, I know.
Dave Bettman, semi-retired, formerly investment banker, but now program chair here at LAI.
All right. And I'm Matt Kimball, which I introduced myself a little bit earlier, and we'll wait for Dan, who's with us, of course, in the room for when he gets started. All right, now we're going to try this online. As we call you out, go ahead and unmute and give yourself a shout out. Susanna, we'll start with you, just because you're first on that list.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Susanna Bergman, a past chapter president. I own a commercial construction company, and I'm glad to see you all. Thank you.
Next up is Joelle Bob. Joelle? She's from the LAI chapter.
I don't think she's here. This is Lynette DeJeanette from the Ely chapter. Joelle was my guest.
That's the thing.
Okay, great. Okay, let's see. I'm gonna do this from a new list. Tara Clifford?
Yeah. You know what? They're calling me to be on. Okay, bye-bye. Bye.
Tara. Now, well, Tara Clifford's a longtime member of this chapter, and glad to see her here virtually. All right, now, let's see. Nate, Bob Leffenfeld. Bob?
Good afternoon, everybody. Bob Leffenfeld with the Clarksville office of Real Property Research Group. Glad to see everybody. And I admire the people that showed up in person.
Great. There's Tara. Tara, you want to unmute? Yeah, there we go.
Hello, friends and comrades. I'm sorry I'm south of you, but I look forward to hearing Dan's presentation. I think it's really important.
It's delighted to have you. Caroline Barney Alvarado. Caroline? Okay, Christine DeVries.
Yeah.
Here.
Yes.
Okay, Christine's with us. David
Yes.
Schultz.
Yeah, hi everybody. So
Here's
I'd love to
David.
be up there, but I'm down here, so I'm in Anne Arundel County.
All right. Let's see.
But I'm
Rachel.
looking forward to Dan's presentation.
Yep.
Hello. I'm sorry to miss seeing you in person today, but I'm glad for this opportunity for two ways to get together.
Here's Rachel.
Thank you. Let's see. Stuart Steinman.
Stuart Steinman, a retired urban planner, worked at the Baltimore Regional Planning Council with Joe Nathanson and Bob Leffenfeld in the previous millennia, and looking forward to this presentation.
Thank you. Tony, who is completely upright now and not sideways.
Good afternoon, everyone. Tony Prince. I'm the LAI Baltimore treasurer, and I'm also I work with the brick companies as the director of finance, and I'm happy to be here today, virtually.
Andy Lamer, who is a past president, I think.
That's true. I'm transitioning from national academies in Washington and back to consulting or something. I guess you could say I'm looking for a job. I don't know.
Yes, well, we're delighted to have Andy back in the fold. Really thrilled to have him back. And
Yes.
I'm remiss, I was going to call out our ex-presidents, which include Susanna and I think Rachel as well. Correct, Rachel? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And Joe.
And Joe.
Right.
Okay, who am I missing next? Ina, are you with us?
Yep. Can't you see us?
Yes, there you are.
Hi. Hello, everybody. And I have a friend with me.
It's Peter.
Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Jordan Peters, Ina's friend. I'm from Chicago. I'm a member of the LAI chapter. Hello, Christine. And great to see you. And hi, Susanna. Hi, Rachel. It's great to see you all.
Well, great to have you and to join you. And one of the wonderful things about having a virtual event is the ability to bring in members from other chapters. So welcome, welcome. Let's see, this thing keeps jumping around, but let me see who we're up to now. Did I do Joe? Did I do you, Joe? Come off of mute. Here we go.
Not until now. And
yes,
I want to say I'm delighted to see all of you, at least those are on Zoom, especially since having had my second cataract surgery yesterday.
Oh.
Doc says I'm doing okay. So there's that to report. And I'll pass it on to the next person.
All right. Let's see. Larry Lund. Larry?
Oh.
Let's see.
Larry's trying to figure out the deck.
Another LAI member, Lynette DeJohnette. Lynette, are you with us?
I am. Good afternoon. I'm Lynette DeJohnette with the LAI chapter in Chicago. I am a member of the program committee, and I currently serve the residents of the Chicago Housing Authority.
Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Wonderful, honey.
I think, let's see, Christine DeVries. Did I get Christine? I think I called her up there. Good. Welcome, welcome, Christine. I think I've covered. I'm not muted. Oh, Nuruddin.
Nuruddin.
Here we go.
My name is Nuruddin Ikramov. I'm a member from Sacramento. I'm a professor at California State University in Sacramento. And thank you for inviting our West Coast or your West Coast brethren to this presentation. Happy to be here.
Thanks for joining us.
We didn't hear from Larry Lund, who is now on screen.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good.
Thanks. I'm just going to be able to join for a short period of time. I have a conflicting meeting that I need to leave to in about 20 minutes, but I'm looking, hopefully this will be on tape and I'll be able to listen to the entire presentation later. But looking forward to getting what I see today. So.
Thank you, Larry. Appreciate it. All right. Anybody else?
And
Okay.
another former president, Larry.
Yeah.
Here we go. Okay, I'm going to call on Nate, please, to come up and tell us about what we've got lined up for September and October, and then also to introduce our speaker today.
Hi. Next month, we're going to have a speaker that was a star at our LAI, and that was Don Mannequin. Those of you who took his tour I know came away extremely excited about what he was doing, particularly with our house and the rest of the Remington neighborhood. And it was one of these highlights of the whole weekend. Don now has a book that is available on Amazon and at local bookstores. It is called The Inside Out Company, Putting Purpose and People First. Don is a co-founder of Seawall Development Company that has taken over or has redeveloped the Remington area. He has worked on community-focused real estate development, civic leadership, and philanthropic missions in the Baltimore, Washington region. And he was the senior vice president of the Mannequin Company for, I think, 25 years, the chief operating officer of Baltimore City Schools, and a graduate of Johns Hopkins, MIT, and Loyola. Also, and in that presentation will be joint in person and Zoom, and it will be on September 15th. Our October presentation is being put together by Seema Iyer. Seema, do you want to say anything about it, or?
Hello. Hi, everybody. I'm Seema Iyer. I oversee the Real Estate and Economic Development Program at the University of Baltimore. And so October is going to be like higher ed and real estate month. We're going to be working with Lindsay Thompson at Johns Hopkins and other universities in the region about education and real estate. That's all I know so far.
Thanks, Seema. And now for today's event. I guess a few years back, my friend Tara Clifford, who's on screen there, kept after me to join LAI, and I didn't. I had studied a little bit of land economics, but didn't really know what it was or what its history was, or why I should join LAI. But since then, I got very interested, and I got very interested and started learning a little bit more about the organization, and some of it wasn't too flattering. If you noticed, there's several people here from the LAI chapter, and that's the Chicago chapter of LAI, and that's named after Mr. Ely, who was, as our speaker today will talk about, was one of the originators of land economics, but also one of the originators of redlining. And so we will have talking about that, a member of this chapter, Dan Pontious. And Dan is the housing policy coordinator at the Baltimore Metropolitan Council. And before that, he spent 2 years coordinating green and healthy homes policy at Baltimore City's Department of Housing and Community Development. And prior to that, he had spent 10 years leading policy and advocacy for Citizens Planning and Housing Association and at the Baltimore Regional Partnership. He has a history degree from Princeton. Dan, take it away. Oh, and if you have any questions, put them in the chat, and when Dan is finished, we'll get them presented to him.
Yeah, I don't know if I can do. Nicole can mute everybody, I suppose. If we, so I am going to try to share my screen now to get. Let's see here. Let me, not totally facile with the new hybrid technology here just yet, but let me do that. And then, although you know what, although I think I'm not sharing the screen just yet. Let me have to share it first, and then let's see. All right, let me try to share that, and then I'm gonna try to, the only problem is then when I put the presentation on, see, then it's sharing the, all right, I'm gonna stop the share and I'm gonna start it again, and this time I'm gonna share, hopefully the right, oh, this worked before. I'm sorry, everybody. All right, can you see the slide now? Yeah, I think this works now, right? Is that, you got the clean slide there now? Okay. All right, great. Let's see. So, well, thanks for having me. I'm gonna, I'm not trained in real estate. I'm trained in history, as you heard. And so I've learned quite a bit about the history of real estate for this presentation, but I also want to thank Joe Nathanson, actually, that the roots of this presentation are the LAI's Color of Law series. I missed the first one, but our friend Joe Nathanson moderated the second one, which was a national kind of remote session. And at the end of that, in talking with Joe, I think we both sort of felt like there could have been, we could have gone deeper into this based on what I had seen about Richard Ely and Homer Hoyt, early leaders of LAI. There was more to say, and so I put an email together, and so it resulted in this invitation to speak to our own LAI Baltimore chapter, and I thought I could just whip something together, but actually, I actually ended up being all this stuff is fascinating, and so I'm going to throw out a whole bunch of slides. Nate mentioned that my day job is the Baltimore Metropolitan Council. I'm the housing policy coordinator. I help local governments push against all these trends. Essentially, that's my job, is to keep them out of fair housing trouble. And so essentially the Fair Housing Act requires grantees, HUD grantees, to try to undo the damage that the federal government did in the 20th century. So that's my job. So I'm drawing on a lot of that, but I'm really just presenting this in my personal capacity. And actually, as a private citizen in Baltimore, I've been having these conversations, even done presentations like this at my church, because we've discovered some history that we didn't realize about our church, our origins of our church. And even my neighborhood, I've learned a lot about the origins of my neighborhood, and even the community association that I lead right now, that I'll talk about a little bit later. So this is not kind of picking on LAI necessarily. My experience is that just about any aspect of American society, you scratch beneath the surface and you find history that has been convenient for white people to forget. So let me, as I get started here, I just want to recognize this journal article that just came out in June of this year. That's all about Richard Ely and his impact on redlining. And so I've emailed these professors. They know I'm doing this. Here's the citation. It's $47 to get this article, but I think it's well worth it if anyone really wants to dig into this. It's fascinating. And I'm borrowing images and content from this and trying to attribute it as much as I can. These are also 5 books that I think are especially good. The most recent one, this Race for Profit by Kiangi Yamada Taylor, a Princeton professor actually, is just devastating. It's about when the federal government turned its attention from white suburban homeownership to African-American homeownership in the late 60s and 70s and how awry that went. And so anyway, but these are resources. Crabgrass Frontier has a lot of this history in a 1985 book. So let's dive right in. Here's Richard Ely. He was a child during the Civil War. He was 11 when the Civil War ended. Apparently, like a lot of 19th century economists, he was trained in Germany. And then he came to Johns Hopkins right here in Baltimore when Johns Hopkins University was downtown on Howard Street, as anyone who's read Not in My Neighborhood knows. And apparently the authors of this journal article say that we were kind of the model for the 20th century research university. Apparently Johns Hopkins was sort of forward thinking in that way. Probably his most famous grad student here at Hopkins was Woodrow Wilson, as a matter of fact. And then in 1885, he was one of the founders of the American Economic Association, which still exists. And I'll come back to that at the end of the presentation. Then in 1892, he moved from Hopkins to the University of Wisconsin, where he stayed for more than 3 decades. And this is where his thinking came together, and this is where some of his more problematic views come out. This is from an article that he published in 1898 where he expresses a lot of sympathy for paternalism, including having government having a role in reproduction. I mean, he really had some problem. And here this quote about him believing that African Americans are like children and should be treated as such. I mean, that tells you a lot about where he is coming from on these types of issues. And as his thinking evolved at the University of Wisconsin, it was all bound up, especially in the early 20th century. I mean, the turn of the 20th century, that's when Jim Crow was being solidified in the southern United States. Reconstruction was long over. The southern whites were solidifying really kind of a terrorist rule. Jim Crow is being solidified, and you had sort of this massive refugee movement from the south to the north, the Great Migration, and it was not necessarily a peaceful migration. There was a anti-Black riot in Springfield, Illinois, in 1908. That was really one of the impetuses for the creation of the NAACP. And there was actually a colleague or friend of Richard Ely's invited him to attend a conference in 1909 that was kind of a prelude to founding the NAACP. And Ely declined, saying that he had long ago resolved that he would not take up the Negro question. So while he's at the University of Wisconsin, he starts to feel like land is an incredibly important thing, and that the economics field does not recognize the importance of the economics of land. He believed that, as you can see from this quote, uncoordinated and profligate urban development potentially threatened the financial well-being of investors and home buyers alike. But he wasn't getting much traction with his fellow economics professors. And so he himself founded this Institute for Land Economics at the University of Wisconsin. The motto is "Under all the land." Here's he's the middle guy there with a number of his colleagues at the University of Wisconsin. So he's kind of starting the study of real estate at the same time that the real estate industry is starting to organize itself as well. So in 1908 in Chicago, this is all, the Midwest is just an incredible fertile ground for this innovation. So the National Association of Real Estate Boards is founded in 1908 in Chicago. That has evolved into the National Association of Realtors. It's still with us today. And what they're doing is sort of creating their code of conduct. They finalized in the early 1920s Articles 34 and 35, which basically said that the ethical thing for a real estate agent to do is, regardless of what their client wants, they must maintain segregation. And when they say, when they talk about individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood, they mean non-white people. These are mainly white communities in the Midwest that were facing change because of the Great Migration. So I told you about the 1908 riot in Springfield. Well, there was a big 1919 riot in Chicago as well. 38 people died, 23 of them African-American. There was a commission appointed that issued a report that said, yes, we should try to improve the conditions in Black neighborhoods in Chicago, but we really need to maintain segregation as well. So all of this is happening in the Midwest as these changes are occurring as well. And so what Richard Ely did was he really brought together academia and the practitioners. So he founds the Institute for Land Economics in 1920. Then he meets with this new real estate trade association in 1921, and they jointly organized a 1923 conference on real estate education at Madison, and they create a course. They create the first course of study in real estate. First a 2-year course, then becomes a 4-year course. And one of Richard Ely's students goes to work for NAREB and writes the first principles of real estate practice, which becomes the first textbook for real estate study in the United States. And Nate, I did a little draft of this for Nate, and he said, what does that say? And so I went and found some, and sure enough, in the textbook, it says, matter of common observation, purchase of property by certain racial types is very likely to diminish the value of other property in this section. So this underlay, this concern about maintaining white neighborhoods underlay the organization of the real estate industry, and underlay the creation of real estate as an economic endeavor. In this June 2021 journal article, the authors say that he believed the essential in maintaining long-term value was the ability to assure constant conditions, that they would remain the same a decade or more after a family moved into a house, and that separating Black from white was deemed fundamental to preserving real estate values. And so deed restrictions became very popular at this time, and this is an Institute for Land Economics publication by one of his students that promotes the use of deed restrictions in subdivision development. So that's Richard Ely, and let's move to Homer Hoyt, another early leader of Lambda Alpha. He was president in the early 1940s. He kind of embodied this practitioner academic kind of fusion. He was actually a real estate broker himself. Then he went to the University of Chicago to get his doctorate. While he was at the University of Chicago, he worked with Ely colleagues at Northwestern. And then Kenneth Jackson in Crabgrass Frontier says that he's the one who really kind of codified and legitimized the idea that the influx of certain ethnic groups was likely to participate in price declines. And so here again, you see this sort of, the kind of, in the same way that eugenics did, the legitimacy and, kind of bringing into academia these prejudices of the time. And in fact, Homer Hoyt in his 1933 PhD thesis, he literally listed racial and ethnic groups in order of positive to negative impact on land values. And then he gets his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1933, and in 1934, he goes to Washington to become the chief economist at the new Federal Housing Administration, and where they did a lot of mapping that was very influenced by his mapping. He kind of came up with this idea of zoning, mapping zones in communities while he was at the University of Chicago. And these we'll talk a little more about these redlining maps, but this is a website that's also fascinating. They've actually digitized all of the redlining maps from all around the country. There were more than 200 of them. You see just sort of the national reach from this map on this slide, how the incredible national reach of these maps. And there's all the supporting documentation. You can look at Baltimore's and see all the notes for all the different zones, why they rated them the way they did. A lot of information about the racial and ethnic makeup and economic makeup of the area. So you have real estate getting organized in the Midwest in the aughts and the teens and the 20s. You have Ely and his colleagues sort of consolidating real estate as an academic practice, working together with the real estate industry to do that. And then you have the Great Depression. You have a huge real estate catastrophe across the country. and Ely's network was right there, ready to be tapped by the Roosevelt administration. Here you can see, houses across the country lost 40% of the value of the money lent to them. So Congress creates, when I used to do these presentations, I would say there was no TARP in the Great Depression, but actually there was a TARP in the Great Depression. The 1933 Homeowners Loan Act appropriated $2 billion to bail out 1 million loans, a million bad mortgages in the country. And then in 1934, you had the National Housing Act that created the FHA. And so you had, but prior to the Great Depression, mortgages were pretty haphazard. They were mostly very short term, maybe 15 years at the longest. Generally, you had to put up half the value of the property in order to get a loan. Sometimes you had to do it every 5 years. And so what these guys said is that, interestingly, after a huge value and mortgage crisis, they said, what we really need to do is lend for longer periods of time. We have to cover more of the property's value from the loan. We want to kind of systematize this and make it stable. And in order to do that, though, they required greater security measures, including anticipating future neighborhood trends with particular attention to race. And in fact, those redlining maps were called residential security maps. The idea is if you're going to do these loans, you need to make sure that the value is going to persist. And Ely's network, Homer Hoyt, a whole bunch of Ely students. Ely was in his 70s at the time. He didn't go to Washington, but his network and his students did. And they became part of Roosevelt's brain trust for the New Deal. And so they kind of institutionalized a lot of the principles that Ely and his colleagues had put together at Madison and then Northwestern. And they put it together. The appraisal industry gets organized here. The realtors organize one trade association for appraisers. The building and loan folks organize another one. And then in 1936, you have Homer Hoyt working at the FHA. They come out with their underwriting manual warning against inharmonious groups. And so it was really the Homeowners Loan Corporation did the security maps, the redlining maps, but it was the FHA that would persist through the post-World War II era and embed these principles in our society. What that meant was that these loans that they were cooking up, these longer loans, low interest, very favorable to homeowners, were for white people. They were for white people buying new homes in the suburbs. And so into the 1960s, 98% of the loans that the FHA loans were to white Americans. And so that you have that impact. And then you also have these Ely network of folks in the Roosevelt New Deal administration, very conscious of getting their information, kind of embedding it in the private sector across the country as well. So they held this National Appraisal Forum in 1937 in Washington, D.C., where the federal staff from the HOLC and the FHA come together with the appraisers. And their goal was to demonstrate the soundness of the administration's risk rating system. They would explain how they do these methods of evaluation and teach them to the practitioners that were going to use them all across the country. The Homeowners Loan Corporation held technical conferences in a whole bunch of cities around the country. And then in this book, Race for Profit, Kiangi Yamada Taylor says, even after the Fair Housing Act in 1973, a study guide for the American Institute of Real Estate Appraisers said that as a general rule, homogeneity of the population contributes to stability of real estate values. That's how embedded this has become in our society. So let me kind of move to, that's sort of some national context and the roots of real estate as a course of study. Let me move to Baltimore now. Baltimore, obviously Richard Ely did not invent discrimination and bigotry. He was kind of reflecting a lot of views of the time. And in fact, in Baltimore here, we were the pioneers of racial zoning legislation. Long before we had a Euclidean zoning law, we tried to zone, the city council and the mayor tried to zone the city by race. And you can see these quotes from this astonished New York Times article here, talk about how the idea was to protect land values for white people in the city. This is where it gets a little personal for me too. I live in a 1925 bungalow in the Radnor-Winston neighborhood, right between Loyola and York Road. 1917, there are other cities that copied Baltimore. So these racial zoning laws kind of spread around the country, but then were struck down by the Supreme Court in 1917. And then lo and behold, you get Euclidean zoning. And anybody who's read Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, he kind of draws that connection pretty clearly. So in my 1925 house, our land was zoned so you couldn't build row houses on it. And then I checked, just because I'm doing this work, I checked our original deed a few years ago, and sure enough, our little modest bungalow has a racially restrictive covenant on it, prohibiting African Americans from living, renting, owning, living in the house, except as servants, which kind of shows you what that was all about. It's not that they couldn't live there. It's just they could only live there if they were subservient to a white family. And that was legally enforceable. So my own neighborhood was built as a neighborhood for white people. Again, as the Great Migration is happening, including to Baltimore, even though we're south of the Mason-Dixon line. And here is the Homeowners Loan Corporation 1937 redlining map of Baltimore. And you can read the descriptions that they gave for, it was 4 grades. The dark green is the top, the best grade, grade A. The kind of gray blue shade is B, that's almost as good. C is the yellow and D is the red. These are the first redline. This is where the term redlining kind of originates. And you can see that they saw the best neighborhoods were new neighborhoods. This even Roland Park didn't get the best because it was too old at this point. These were Guilford, Homeland, Northwood, new and upcoming Roland Park Company, racially restricted communities got the best grade. They are homogeneous, the description says. Grade C, the yellow areas, it says they're characterized by, they have expiring restrictions or the lack of them. And then grade D represents, detrimental influences in a pronounced degree, undesirable population. This is all about who is living there. So this is the 1937 redlining map. Then here's a couple slides from my work at BMC. You can see even in 1980, this is a map of African-American population. Even by 1980, 40 years after that redlining map, 12 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act, African-American population extremely segregated in certain parts of Baltimore City. And then 30 years later, 2010, it's not that we have become an integrated community. The African Americans have gained access to new parts of the region, but then again this sort of mentality that African American, this kind of idea that Richard Ely kind of embedded into academia, and then brought into our government that essentially that African Americans are a threat to your property, and so white people left. There was sort of a transitional integrated period in there are 19 census tracts that were less than 25% African American in 1980 and more than 75% African American in 2010. And then this is one of the more recent. I don't have the 2020 census data yet, but this is 2016. Again, the fourth quintile starts at 80%. Even now, extremely high levels of segregation for African Americans. And the one racial group that rivals that for levels of segregation is the non-Hispanic white population. And here you see where, the darkest quintile here is 80% non-Hispanic white. And you see sort of where white segregation is most prevalent in the Baltimore region. And a lot of things flow from that. Here's elementary school performance. Astonishing how, test scores reflect the racial patterns across the region. And you would imagine that if test scores, which a lot of parents equate with school quality, correlate so closely with racial patterns. Again, these messages that have been being sent to us by people like Richard Ely's network and the redlining maps. It's probably not surprising that just in the last few years, there have been huge controversies over redistricting. The Sun did a series in 2018 about Baltimore County controversies over redistricting there. And then if people remember in 2019, in Howard County, choose civility in Howard County, you scratch beneath the surface. This was an effort to, kind of make the low income rates, student rates more even around the schools. And there were huge protests around that. It got very ugly. And then even the Kerwin Commission, which was not about segregation of schools, but just about resources, was controversial, and the legislature just this year overrode the governor's veto of that legislation. And then here's the 21st century foreclosure crisis. And you see the patterns. The darker brown parts of this map are where foreclosures were the highest. Also, where subprime mortgages were the highest. So even in the run up to the foreclosure crisis, where banks were issuing all kinds of irresponsible mortgages, they were, there is evidence, and in fact, in the city's Wells Fargo lawsuit, which was settled they had evidence that banks were targeting African-American communities, again, aided and abetted by segregation, targeting African-American communities with subprime loans, which then resulted in more foreclosures. And then talk about land economics. This is a story that Jane Miller did on WBAL in February of 2020, looking at Kielty homes, pretty much the same home built in Edmondson Village and in Rogers Forge, incredible value difference there. Rogers Forge still, like essentially, I think 95% white. So these are, and then this is from our fair housing analysis, which we just finalized last year. Again, long after the Federal Housing Administration first started promoting home ownership for white people, these patterns are really embedded in our society. The white non-Hispanic home ownership rates, the gray bars on these on this graph, the gray bars on this graph, you can see it's far and above any other racial group. And this, in fact, is one of our action steps. This data just kind of really smacked us in the face last year, and we have a series of strategies to try to tackle these, which need to be, that needs to be done very intentionally. I mean, all this stuff that was embedded in our society starting in the New Deal has set these things on autopilot, and if we want to change them, we need to be very intentional about that. And then finally, here's a map. Raj Chetty, a Harvard economist, got the income data for 20 million people born between 1978 and 1983 across the country. This is, if you go to this website, you can do it. It's interactive. You can look at any place around the country. And then he followed them longitudinally to see how much they were earning in, at age 35, in the middle 2010s. And he mapped their earnings at 35 back to where they grew up. And this is what you get. This is for low-income children growing up in the 80s, essentially 80s and 90s. This is what they're earning as adults. And you can see just the difference here. And my job sort of focuses on the placement of affordable housing. You can imagine that affordable housing, especially for families as opposed to seniors, is very concentrated in those red areas, very concentrated in the city of Baltimore, very concentrated in those red areas. And so a lot of my job is to try to help to push the low-income housing tax credit guidelines to place more affordable housing in these blue areas where kids will have a very different childhood experience. We also have a regional project-based voucher program, which awards project-based vouchers to finance those properties in those the higher opportunity areas. And then there's also a large regional voucher program, the Baltimore Regional Housing Partnership, about 4,400 vouchers as a result of a fair housing lawsuit filed in 1995, where HUD was found liable for concentrating public housing in these red areas. And so now there are more than 4,000 vouchers, and this organization helps families locate in these areas that oftentimes they don't get access to. So those are some of the things that are kind of being done now to try to counteract the influence of the New Deal and post-World War II efforts related to Richard Ely and Homer Hoyt. There's also appraisal gaps. I don't know if folks have heard some of these anecdotal stories of Black homeowners who get their homes appraised and they feel like, wow, that's pretty low. That appraisal is really low. And so they literally kind of scrub their homes of any piece of evidence that there's a Black family that lives there. They find a white friend to stand in and pretend that they're the homeowner, and they call the appraiser back, and the appraisal goes way up. And so, I mean, this is all anecdotal, but it's concerning enough that it's come to the attention of the Biden administration and HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge. He's asked her, and I think Susan Rice, to co-chair a task force to get at this. How do we get at this appraisal bias in the appraisal industry? Here's another, something that grew out of my work at BMC, Columbia Housing Center. Columbia, founded in 1967 by Jim Rouse as a uniquely integrated community, radical at the time, but it's been kind of on autopilot some since then. And you saw from the school redistricting controversy, I mean, there are some pockets of segregation there. And so the Columbia Housing Center is modeled on a housing center in Oak Park, Illinois, on the west side of Chicago, which since about 1972 has been promoting residential integration there. It's an apartment referral service. The idea is if you want to live in Columbia, come through us. We're not up and running yet. We have an executive director we're hoping to open in this coming academic year. But the idea is that we'll help you find the apartment of your dreams, and we'll recommend apartments to you that will further the integration of this area, not further the segregation of the community. And then just my last slide here is just a little coming back to the American Economic Association that Richard Ely helped found in 1885. They had a lecture named after the annual Richard T. Ely lecture, held since 1962. But they, these things about Richard Ely and his views came out, and they were concerned. And the chair of this group, Janet Yellen, in 2020, last year, appointed an ad hoc committee. And they noted these problematic things that Richard Ely, his problematic beliefs, and they changed the lecture name. Now it's called the AEA Distinguished Lecture Series. And so there are other organizations associated with Richard Ely that are reckoning with his the destructive legacy of his views and influence, and trying to do something about it. So, and with that, I think I'll stop the share here and maybe put the, I don't know if that screen will come back up for us or not, but.
All right, yeah, please put your questions into the chat, but in the meantime, let me ask Dan a couple of questions. Dan, what's being done about this now in terms of allowing Blacks to move to the suburbs and other places that have better housing, and what should be done?
I don't know how to get the, oh, you know what, I think I have to, that's right, I have to, let me just end the slideshow here, and I think I'm just trying to set it up here so that we can see you all online. There we go. So I mean, we could do a whole nother session on that. I mean, there are, there are efforts going on. Well, I guess this is a tough question to answer. I mean, my job is to have the local governments kind of push against the patterns of segregation. It's very hard. I'll tell you, it's very hard. They're very deeply ingrained in our society. I mean, zoning patterns, economic disparities, these patterns are very deeply ingrained. I think it takes something like a Columbia Housing Center to fight against. There's new literature out that says that, our whole story of our lives is telling us all of our lives. It's telling us where we should live. Where would be safe for us, where would be good good places for our kids to go to school, where we'll be accepted if we're a person of color, where we won't be harassed or suspected. I mean, in my little neighborhood, which is relatively integrated now, but still predominantly white, we regularly have questions on our listserv about, white people expressing alarm about Black people coming through our neighborhood. So these attitudes are deeply embedded, and so there are efforts to try to help promote affordable housing. I mean, because of the Federal Housing Administration, when public housing was first established, it was segregated. There was public housing for white people, for lower income white people, and public housing for low income Black people. Because of the Federal Housing Administration, a lot of lower income white people went straight from public housing into home ownership in a brand new suburban home, wealth building home, that by the time the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, that home was worth a heck of a lot more than it was worth in 1950 or 1945, 48. And so you had this huge wealth building in the white population, that then by the time discrimination was outlawed, a lot of these homes were economically out of reach for African-American families who could have bought them in 1947. And so we've got the legacy of that. And we're trying to overcome that through the placement. Because of that, that's why public housing is overwhelmingly African American now, because they're the ones that couldn't get out. They were not subsidized by the federal government to move into a wealth building real estate opportunity. And so a lot of what we're doing is where is publicly subsidized housing placed right now. We're doing work around that. But then I do think there needs, other than that though, there's not a lot of appetite. I mean, if you think about school integration, there's not a lot of appetite, public political appetite to grapple with that. And that's all bound up in residential integration. There's not a whole lot of public appetite. I pitched this idea of the Oak Park Regional Housing Center to the whole region. And the one place that it really got traction was in Columbia, where integration was sort of already in the DNA of it. So now I'm hopeful that it will get it up and running there, and it can become a model for how, when you think about this intentionally, and you really try intentionally to push against this mindset that Richard Ely and all of his colleagues and Homer Hoyt were trying to instill in everybody across the country. When you push against that, good things can happen.
What is LAI as an institution doing to address the legacy issues?
Well, I don't think I can answer that question.
Is there anyone out there that has an answer to that?
Hi, this is Christine DeVries. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
We hear you.
Okay, you should be able to see me. I don't know. I am LAI historian, and let me take a shot at that. You know that this is the year that LAI is celebrating its 90th anniversary, and part of that celebration has been, a big part of it has been looking at our history. And the Color of Law series that you referenced before, the 3-part series, was really kind of setting the table for us understanding more about our background and Richard T. Ely and Homer Hoyt. And I will say I'm thrilled that Baltimore has brought this to the local level with some of the local information and how it affects you. So we recognize, we've discussed at the executive board level, we've discussed, for instance, you saw this slide about the American Economics Association kind of disnaming a lecture series for Richard T. Ely. And so we are looking at, first of all, putting out a statement that shows that we are aware, and then what we might do. And so we're bringing people into that discussion so that we really address it properly for the society. But we don't have that statement right now, and we welcome anybody's participation in that discussion and getting to the point of having a statement.
Thank you. Another question from the chat was the GI Bill after World War II equally biased?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that it was. I mean, it provided money for higher education at a time that higher education was segregated. And so there weren't, so Black GIs were eligible for the help, but there weren't as many places for them to go to school. So, so yeah, the whole, that is the thing. People kind of forget that there was a whole lot of government-sponsored wealth building that was much more open to white people in the post-World War II era. Housing is probably the most striking of them, but there were other examples too. Higher education is another one.
Yeah. What? Come on up here.
You mentioned.
Yeah.
You mentioned that Columbia was a very successful or ongoing example that's positive. Have they been able to study the economics of that to prove that bringing Blacks in and minorities has not negatively affected property values, so they could then use that story to go out and also help that become a model for other places?
I don't know that Columbia has specifically studied that themselves. I know one of the pitches that we make for the Columbia Housing Center is that integration, stable racial integration works really well for maintaining home values. So if you look at Oak Park, Illinois, the Chicago region is even more segregated than the Baltimore region. In general, we're sort of similarly highly segregated metropolitan areas. And so Oak Park is this little village of 52,000 people that's kind of this island of integration within a very segregated region. And what they've been kind of proud of is that their home values have, in fact, if anything, they have a trouble with like higher and higher and higher home values in Oak Park. So there is, I think, quite a bit of evidence that, there's a lot of study being done. There's Andre Perry at the Brookings Institution has done study of the devaluation of Black neighborhoods. Again, this sort of Richard Ely, Homer Hoyt, scientific, that was what Richard Ely is trying to do. He's trying to make all these real estate ideas scientific, that integration is bad, it was sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't know about the 2020, what the 2020 census says off the top of my head, but when we did our fair housing analysis, we're 56% non-Hispanic white. If white people will not consider living in your neighborhood, that's going to really affect the value. That's just supply and demand. And so one of the things that we're the way we're pitching the Columbia Housing Center is if you can make sure that all of Columbia is attractive to all of the market, that's how you create stable real estate values for. Yeah. Yeah, some academic real estate program should get on that.
Why not compare Baltimore to Washington, D.C. In these trends?
You can, I guess. DC is a very, has a lot more demand overall right now, but there have been, the patterns of use of the public schools, and it's somewhat similar. There's any city you can notice segregation patterns. There's a lot more pressure of demand and rising property values, gentrification in DC than there is in Baltimore. But there are, and so a lot of the areas that were predominantly African American are having a lot of price pressure on them now. So it's hard. Being the center of the national government makes it a little different.
Can I make a comment on that? Because that's not where the question was really going.
Okay.
Sure. Yes. All right, Dan, the point being is that you covered history really well and in Baltimore, and you showed evidence of actual racial segregation. And so the issue is, did DC do the same thing or not? Number one. Number two, since you looked at a period of time since pre-depression, and I got a little late on your presentation, I apologize, but I think the comparison of DC, you mentioned demand, and what we're talking, demand has nothing to do with racial segregation. Okay. So
I would disagree with that, Joe.
Well, what I'm saying, you're looking at it backwards in terms of looking at in the rear. Yes, demand has a lot to do with segregation. No one wants to be in a certain neighborhood. But the point being that if you did the same thing you did with Baltimore and gave reasons why certain things happen, then maybe you can begin to see that DC actually maybe became more segregated. Desegregated. I grew up in a Catholic school that in 1960s and 70s was not segregated. Okay, having said that, isn't that part of the answer?
Isn't what part of the answer?
Isn't that part of the answer, that where segregation doesn't come in terms of black and white, but actually more involved, anyone could go there. We had all kinds of nationalities, backgrounds, and racial composition in St. John's Baptist de La Salle and Chilham, Maryland, for instance. So what I am basically saying is, for your analysis to actually come forward, instead of the redlining that you're saying is written in code practically in Baltimore, why not compare it to another area that's not so written in code and try to find out why the segregation still occurred?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that DC is as different. I have not studied DC, but I don't know that it's as different as you say it is, actually. I mean,
trust me, I'm an appraiser. And I've appraised in both areas. So when you talk about values, I can tell you it's different.
Well, there was a period of school integration when we cared about school integration as a country, from the 60s into the 80s to the late 80s. You know, our schools were getting more integrated, and that has backslid since then, all across the country.
Okay.
I raised my hand.
I can say all across the country, but I'm talking about Washington, D.C. That's all.
My question was skipped over, so I'm going to insert myself at this point. Dan, first of all, great job as a historian. It's good that we have a historian in our chapter. But my question is, both you and I have worked on analysis of impediments to fair housing studies. I can't answer this question. What impact has it had, either for Baltimore, the Baltimore region, or nationally, to your knowledge?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, yeah. I mean, it's hard. I mean, in terms of looking at macro levels, it's very hard to push against these trends that are now embedded in our society. So, you know, I mean, a lawsuit can do a lot. You know, the Thompson versus HUD lawsuit resulted in a 4,400 voucher program in a region where we only have about 25. You know, it's like 25,000 vouchers in the Baltimore region. You know, so it's not most, but it's a pretty good chunk. You know, although actually our analysis of impediments said even with those vouchers, still people with vouchers, even though vouchers, the whole idea was you could live wherever you want. The patterns are that there's a lot of trouble with people accessing. Now, we recently have passed source of income protection so that landlords can no longer say, oh, if you have a housing voucher, I'm not even going to consider renting to you. That they can't do that anymore. So that hopefully that will make a difference over time. But we are, I mean, I've been doing this since 2012. I think that's the lesson from when you worked on these, Joe, in the early 2000s. The region did its first fair housing analysis in 1996. I think what they learned in doing their 2012 analysis was that if you don't have somebody focusing on the regional things full time, you know, the action steps are not really going to move all that much. And so that's why they put what became my position into the HUD Sustainable Communities application in 2011. And so we've been working at it for 9 years now. And we've awarded 102 vouchers. We've awarded a lot more than that, but 102 vouchers are moving forward as part of affordable housing developments in opportunity areas. That is incredibly hard. I mean, it's been very interesting, like trying to get into to be a practitioner on this, to see just all the obstacles from school capacity to zoning to financing to low-income housing tax credit rules at the state level. There are so many obstacles to fighting these trends. So, you know, 102 vouchers in we've been doing this for 5 years now. It's not a lot. We have one housing center that's just hired its first executive director. It's not even in operation yet. We're just starting to look into what, doing kind of focus groups and surveying of housing counselors and people who've gone through housing counseling around the region. Because why is it that in Anne Arundel County, for example, the classes that start housing counseling have a good representation of people of color, but then when it comes to the people who actually take advantage of the county's down payment assistance program, it's very different. Like we have to figure that where do people drop out and what can we do about that? I guess that's what I'm saying. Like what Richard Ely and Homer Hoyt did was sort of document, this is what we see happening on the ground. And they kind of translated into, and that's how it should, we need to work with that. That's how it is. And so we need to, and they did things to make things self-fulfilling prophecy. I think we need to decide, do we need to approach it differently? Do we need to say, okay, maybe that's the result of historic prejudices that go back 400 years in this country, but do we want to see things happen differently? And if we want things to be different, we have to be, the lesson of my last 9-year career is that you need to be extremely intentional about that if you're going to make any difference at all.
Thank you.
We're getting toward the time limit, but I think first, Joe, I was about to ask your question. I didn't want to ignore you, but glad you asked it. But John DeVries has an interesting comment. And John, do you want to make that to the group?
Yes, I think it's important to look at Oak Park model, not just in terms of the legislative framework, but they put the good faith and credit of the village behind a citywide insurance program. And it underwrote the values. Basically, is a proposition of, and for those of you not familiar with the geography of Oak Park, it butts up right against a very low income area of low and moderate income area of Chicago, Austin. So there was great fear at the time they instituted this policy, and it's been in place now three decades or something. And they basically said, if you come and buy in Oak Park, no matter what your ethnic origins or whatever, we will appraise the house at the point we'll take the value you paid for it, and backed up by appraisals and so on. And if that value goes down, we will pay you the difference. And it took this. It goes back to the original rationale of the redlining. Is it goes back to the original underwriting rationale of redlining, which was how do you preserve housing value? And in this case, it flipped it. Instead of how are we preserving housing value for the National Housing Administration, it said how do we preserve housing value for the purchasers, for the residents. And I think it's been an enormously successful model. And the punchline is, as I typed in, there's been virtually no payout. And Oak Park is very successfully integrated. It's a community of first choice for people, professionals moving into Chicago. Evanston, by the way, is a footnote to this, and Christine can talk about this because she's visited with them, is dedicating its municipal revenue from its recently legalized marijuana stores to what the newspapers call a reparation program. But basically, it puts capital available to Black families who want to purchase, particularly long-term renters who want to purchase the homes they're in or homes in their neighborhood, and brings extra equity to bear to compensate for the equity they've lost by not being able to own. The jury's out on how well that one works, but the jury is in on Oak Park. And if you're talking about Oak Park as an example, I highly commend the insurance aspect, the underwriting aspect to you, the insurance aspect, if you will, along with the legal framework.
That's a fantastic. I'm really glad that you brought that up because it does, like you said, it flips it on its head. What Homer Hoyt and Richard Ely were saying is, beware, these detrimental influences are going to hurt your property values, and that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because then when you move out, the prophecy becomes true. And what this did is it sort of protected people against that. It said, you know what, if you buy here, no matter what happens, you're going to be insured against the loss in your value. And so no one had to be afraid of that loss in their value. And so people didn't move out. And so the values, and that became a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Well, that's exactly right. And the punchline, if you will, is that values have steadily increased in Oak Park. So they're almost a multiple of what they were when this policy was started. It's becoming a hugely desirable area, integrated area. It certainly benefits from proximity to UIC and some other positive factors. It has 2 direct rapid transit connections to the downtown, which has prospered. But again, I think there are many communities surrounding Oak Park who didn't have these kind of policies, who stayed just as rigidly segregated as they were when Oak Park put their policy in place. So I think it is a great case study.
It actually did get in Baltimore too. The Able Foundation brought it to the Madison Park neighborhood of Baltimore City, and it was very successful there as well. But this is a great point because it shows if you set up different goals, you can use the principles of real estate to reach very different ends. And it's really being intentional to what do we want the goals to be, and then what are the tools that can help us.
Well, to Richard T. Ely's credit, he would say what it does is it connects policy to the underlying economics. And so anyway, that's a way of saying you can put all the non-discrimination language out there you want to, but unless you connect it to the underlying economics, it's probably not going to make any difference. Thank you.
Oh, there's a couple more questions in the chat. I think we're past our time, but so I want to thank you, Dan, for a terrific presentation. And look forward to seeing you either here in person or on chat or on online a month from now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.